West Virginia just rewrote the rules. A state once known for some of the toughest vaccine mandates in America is now opening the door wide to religious exemption in its schools. Supporters call it freedom. Critics call it a gamble. What does it really mean for families? Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you are allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have with us today. First, we have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. We also have with us Mr. Vilo Weiss, who's from the Indiana Conference and the Public Affairs Religious Liberty Department. We have with us also Dr. Amilcar Grosso Jr., professor of philosophy, ethics, and systematic theology. And then we have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the director of government affairs for the North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Great to have you guys here with us and looking forward to our show today. The federal government has picked a side in an ongoing battle that has pitted West Virginia Governor Patrick Morrisey and the state health department against the state Board of Education over religious exemptions to the state school compulsory vaccination law. In a letter, the United States Department of Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights said West Virginia should accept religious exemptions to the state school vaccine requirements, citing in favor of an executive order from the governor. You know, Bettina, when I take a look at what's going on, I would have thought that the idea of vaccine mandates had gone out the window once we got done with dealing with COVID. But it seems as though now we even have states that look like they definitely understood what they wanted to do, but now they seem to be changing their minds. What's going on in West Virginia, and is this something we may end up seeing happening in many other states as well?
Well, Orlin, it's a bit of a mess, actually, because you have different people pulling in different directions. You have the federal government, you have the political branches down there in West Virginia, the courts, the parents. They're all on different pages on this issue. And so I think what we need to do is kind of pull back and look at the big picture, because what's happening here is an attempt to try to balance two very important values. And one is, you know, the sacred constitutional right to protect religious liberty. That's a real issue here. And also protecting children from preventable disease. That also is a pressing concern. My concern here, Orlin, is as this plays out, the whole idea of religious exemptions generally may become somewhat devalued. And I think that if everything becomes a religious exemption, nothing is a religious exemption. Religious exemptions function simply because they operate on the margins. They happen in small enough quantities, in small enough numbers, that they're not undermining public policy. And so the government can accommodate conscience without negating its own policies. But what we're seeing here in West Virginia, what we're seeing in other states ever since the COVID era, is this sort of explosion of exemption claims, which makes this whole sort of weighing process that much more difficult. I think we have to guard against devaluing religious exemptions.
Yeah, and I agree. That's exactly the point. It really seems to me that what's new here isn't just a public health dispute. It's actually a constitutional one with public health implications. So the federal HHS Office for Civil Rights essentially said that if the state's religious freedom statute requires exemptions through the Equal Protection of Religious Act, then you just can't punish health departments that acknowledge those exemptions. That's a very significant legal statement, even though, as we know, the letter doesn't necessarily have enforcement teeth, right? Well, then we have the Board of Education, who doesn't think that the compulsory vaccination law does not include exemptions. So here we have that classic conflict once again that Bettina was referring to. And it seems to be an increasing conflict between statutory interpretation versus religious freedom protections that cannot be banalized. So we really need to recognize those two serious goods here. There's public health and there's also conscience. When those two collide, the law tells us that we must use the least restrictive means to protect compelling interests. The question isn't health or conscience, but actually, how do we honor both in responsible ways? And that's where thoughtful policy needs to step in, and definitely not with political or ideological slogans.
Wow. Well, Melissa, I'm hearing so much chatter about vaccine for children in Washington, D.C., even today, that there was a time where it was clearly agreed upon. If you went to school, these are the vaccines you had. But since COVID, all these conversations seem to be so murky. And I thought at some point this was always about the best interest of the child. But the question is, some of these exemptions that people are asking for seem to be more political than maybe religious.
Well, and I think that's where we talk about what is motivating us, right? Is it our sincerely held belief, or is it our political ideology? And who gets to determine which of those, your belief falls into? Arlen, I was surprised when I was reading a bit about this story that West Virginia, prior to this, was only one of 5 states that did not allow religious exemptions from the vaccine requirements in public schools. Yeah. I was surprised by that. I thought that more of our state school systems would not have allowed that. Bettina made the good point about the reason why religious exemptions often exist, in whether it's in the workplace, whether it's, we're talking about vaccine exemption, is because it's a minority request, or it's a minority, it's falling on the edges. And so I wonder, hopefully the fact that we're seeing this already take place in the vast majority of other states, perhaps it is not being abused in the way that potentially it could be. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. Maybe I'm being a little bit of an optimist right then, but it'll probably be a couple of flu seasons before we actually understand or see just how much impact this is.
Viola, could you have ever imagined that we would be looking at healthcare issues as turning into some of the most polarizing conversations from a political standpoint, and the idea of what we'd like to see children getting? It used to be get as much as you can, but now there seems to be this pushback, and now I wouldn't say it's shrouded in religion, but it's clearly boxed from a religious standpoint. And I think as Bettina kind of made that comment, I'm getting concerned that if we cry this too often, we'll be like the boy who cried wolf.
That's true. I remember when I was a kid taking a polio vaccine in a sugar cube. And, one of the things about most of the vaccines that I took, they prevented me from catching a disease. But it was interesting with COVID, they called it a vaccination. Now it could mitigate for a number of people, the disease. I would have felt more comfortable if they just called it a shot, because, I see a vaccine as something that prevents it. And here in West Virginia, you've got the governor weighing in, he's got his executive order, and the school board is fussing about that. But they've forgotten, or at least they're ignoring the fact that their legislature passed a state RFRA. And, it's got to be the least restrictive way of furthering a compelling government interest, as has already been said today. And I'm not sure that they've taken that seriously.
Well, Bettina, what could be the fix in this? It looks like, you've got competing interests, the governor, and I'm going to be the first one to tell you can't take politics out of politics. So there's a little bit of that obviously going on here. But in the sake of the children in West Virginia, what might be an ideal way around all of this?
Well, if you're asking me for a solution, I would say pull the plug on social media. I think that would be a really productive first step, because the discussion that we're having today is a very nice legal discussion. It's about constitutional issues and public health issues. The conversation about this that's taking place in the social media sphere is something entirely different. It's unhinged, it's divorced from reality, and it's couched in terms that are inflammatory and which are not conducive to finding the essential middle ground, which we're all sort of groping for here. So, that would be my ideal fix for this. But in terms of a legal fix, the answer is what it's always been, and that is it's up to the courts to take seriously religious freedom rights, which are grounded in the First Amendment and, in this case, a state RFRA. Take them seriously. That is actually one of the upsides of the upheaval that we saw around the COVID vaccine, that people are taking this more seriously. They're understanding that these rights exist. But it will be sort of a careful, very thread the needle type approach that's needed. Can I just say to what Viola was saying also about polio? I remember hearing stories from my father about schoolmates who ended up in an iron lung because of polio. We've come so far through vaccines. It would be a shame to take backward steps right now.
Wow.
Orlin, if I could just jump in, I wanted to, both Bettina and Viola mentioned RFRAs, right? Well, just for the casual viewer, that's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that's a federal piece of legislation that, again, is trying to find this balance of, a government action versus religious practice. The reason why I wanted to jump back to that is because Bettina's earlier point about, crying wolf and then sort of ruining it for those that really need that, and her concern about the potential, sort of misuse or overuse of this exemption. And it's been interesting, working in the federal sphere, where in the last couple of years, there have been multiple pieces of legislation that have tried to do away with or circumvent the federal version of RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so, and again, that was due to a misuse or overuse, right, of that very important protection. We talked about least restrictive means. We talked about compelling interest, but it's a very real potential consequence as far as then one side wanting to actually take away the whole opportunity for another.
Milka, I see you shaking your head rather in acknowledgement, but when you take a look at some of these things, you're someone who's seeing students on a regular basis, and Bettina talked about social media. What is the sense of the younger generation when these topics come up? I mean, we're talking about polio vaccines and things that go back to the 50s, but there's a new group that's looking at these issues. Well, what is your sense on a college campus with these type of topics?
Yeah, the college campus, and also with parishioners here at churches. I also pastor a church. You can see that the level of discussion, as Bettina alluded to, is not one that is very oriented towards the facts and common good, but more ideology and politics. The hyperpolarization that we're still experiencing, hopefully transcending that towards healing, is the ideal environment. Trust needs to be rebuilt for those conversations to be healthy.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word, and I think this is a great conversation. It's something that we'll talk about a little bit more. Coming up, a federal judge strikes down a Minnesota law barring certain religious schools from participating in the popular college credit program. We'll investigate the details when we come back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith and Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. In a court case that's called Lowe versus Jett, a federal judge has struck down a Minnesota law that barred certain religious colleges from participating in a popular state program allowing high school students to earn college credit. The decision was issued a few months ago by U.S. District Judge Nancy Brassel, and she found that the provision violated religious freedom under the First Amendment. The central question involves Minnesota's post-secondary enrollment options program, a 40-year-old initiative that enables high schoolers to take tuition-free college courses for credit at public or private institution. Since its inception, nearly 60,000 students have taken advantage of the program, which is funded by the state. You know, Viola, when I take a look at something that seems to be working, seems to have impact, and seems to be putting us in a position where we should be able to have a better idea of how to handle these things, what's going on with this particular case?
Well, this sounds a lot like a couple of prior Supreme Court cases that of course, this hasn't gone that high, but it's in the federal system. But, you know, I think, first of all, about Trinity Lutheran out of Missouri, where they applied for a rubber playground surface, and it was turned down by the state because it would violate the Establishment Clause. But the Supreme Court said, well, hey, you can't discriminate based on religion. And then even more recently, you have Carson out of Maine. And that one really stunned me because I had no idea that about half of Maine school districts don't operate a high school. And so they paid for students to go to another school, provided it was non-sectarian because of their constitution. And the Carsons and two other families wanted their children to get a Christian education, to go to a Christian high school. And so they filed suit and ended up before the justices there, and they, in essence, saying, hey, guys, you can't discriminate based on free exercise. So we've got an interesting line of cases here that I would construe as Establishment Clause. But the Supreme Court is construe them as free exercise clause cases.
You know, it's interesting, Orlin, you mentioned in your introduction of this conversation that this is a program that had been around and operating successfully for over 40 years. And I think that the conflict that we're now seeing is the result of a couple of different things, which are both of which Bettina alluded to one of them: social media and sort of I think our whole panel did, as far as the partisanship that we're seeing in the last couple of years that have really changed things. And then the second thing is, we're seeing more and more states, and I think now the vast majority of states, having supermajority as far as political power. And so what we've seen in Minnesota is, now that there's a Democratic governor and Democrats control both chambers, we've seen, this is just one example of legislation that has basically been stripping back long-standing religious freedom issues. We've talked about it before in other situations, but I think it's those two things. It's now, unfortunately, our politics are shaping common sense, I guess, maybe in some ways. And then in the second situation is, when we have those supermajority governments, we see real impactful changes taking place.
You know, Amilcar, I'm trying to understand what's going on. I've always believed that there's a religious right, but I've also always believed that there's a religious left as well. So this idea that somehow that religion belongs to one side or another doesn't seem to really cut it for me. And in this particular instance, why get involved in something that's been working? I mean, if it's not broken, why try to fix it?
Don't fix it. Yeah, that's exactly it. This is very significant because access to education, I believe all of us here would agree with that. It should not be conditioned to abandoning religious identity at all. So if a program is publicly funded to expand academic opportunity, that opportunity should be available to citizens without penalizing them for their religious alignment. But then we have two different possibilities here. On one hand, I really believe that faith schools serve important civil and social functions, shaping the character of their students, community service-oriented dynamics, and even moral reasoning, right? So this decision affirms the religious schools are legitimate partners in education, not outliers to be excluded. But now, there's another side to this. When public money flows to religious colleges, the community has to wrestle with real hard questions. Maybe the first one being about accountability. public funds are typically tied to anti-discrimination rules, transparency standards, and even oversight mechanisms. So when funds support schools that have faith-based admissions or doctrinal statements of belief and even behavior, some payers might legitimately ask if their money is indirectly underwriting institutional discrimination or even exclusion.
Bettina, that seems like that's where the rub is. You know, it doesn't seem so much that people don't want to see education happening at all levels, but when my money has to be involved, do I want some standards to be there? And I think that's where we find ourselves in a real quagmire, because there's some people who wonder, are religious organizations getting a pass?
Well, here's the thing, Orlin. I mean, this was predicted by James Madison, the father of our Constitution. And one of his overarching concerns was always that mixing government dollars with religious mission was going to produce sectarian conflict. And right here in 2025-26, we have a prime example of that happening. You know, history repeats. So when you have a religious mission that is receiving government funding or support, whether directly or indirectly, you're always going to have these concerns. As Amilcar said, you know, you have these strings attached, you have, you're always having to watch your back. You know, are you keeping your mission pure? Are you serving your religious identity? Are you refusing to compromise? These are all questions that are inevitably going to come when you take state funding. Now, clearly the Supreme Court is moving down an entirely different track. We're really not quite clear yet how far the Supreme Court is going to go down that track. But the 2022 Carson case out of Maine that was referenced earlier, I think gives us a very clear indication that their interpretation of the Free Exercise Clause really kneecaps the Establishment Clause. I think that's the bottom line. The Free Exercise Clause is being used to support religious funding of religious institutions at the expense of Establishment Clause restraints. For me, that's a concern.
But Vilo, is it an unreasonable argument for the average taxpayer to say that I want my dollars to go someplace that has no religious connection at all? I mean, is that really outrageous? I mean, when you think about what we're supposed to have, a separation of church and state, because it seems like that's part of the push here, but it looks like the court came back and said, no, religious institutions, you should go ahead and be a part of this. Is that a bit of a, oxymoronic thought process going on here?
Well, it could be. Some definitely wouldn't like it, but I think a lot of this is an outgrowth of how polarized our culture and our society has become. It's either all or nothing. Both of our major political parties are so beholden to, it seems to me, to the extremes of their party that it's hard for them to get together and work together for the good of the country. And so it just seems like this is a time of divisiveness like I've never seen in my lifetime. And I don't know how to get out of it, to be honest with you.
Orlin, could I answer that question as
Sure,
well?
please do.
Okay, so it's interesting because Valo mentioned the court case that was several years back that was dealing with repaving a parking lot or something like that at a religious
playground,
playground at a religious school. And the Supreme Court, I agreed with the Supreme Court's decision there as far as this is not a religious action that's taking place, right? It's not part of the ministry of the school. Certainly important, I think, for those that are visiting there or at recess every day. I agreed with that because I don't think that religious institutions should be prevented from participating in something like that. And so asking the question that you ask of, should taxpayers have the right to say, I don't want any of my money going to fund religion? Well, I don't want any of my money, subsidizing gambling or whatever, but that's not my ability. I don't have the ability as a taxpayer to pick and choose which things go. And so I think we as people of faith, it really falls on our shoulders to make sure that faith is viewed as a positive thing within our communities. And so we don't have those conversations, right? They recognize the benefits of our local congregation, of the food pantry that we're, of the homeless shelter, of the school system that we are doing. I think that's where we as citizens can help individuals who don't espouse a particular faith to not view religion in such a hostile way.
So maybe a solution might be that practical aspect of community-oriented service, but also that we ensure that programs have some clear guardrails. So the use of public money requires public responsibility. So we can affirm both the legitimacy of faith-based education while also recognizing that equal access for all religious traditions will require some sort of societal maturity and mutual respect that we are all feeling that is lacking right now. Once again, we go back to trust and the rebuilding of trust within communities.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think, Amilcar, you've kind of hit it right on the head. From a religious standpoint, we have to make sure that we're using our religion to be more of a shield than as acting like a sword, because from that standpoint, society seems to want to be a lot more better to function in a bigger group, including religious individuals. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orlin, did you know that West Virginia has some really cool towns with really cool names? Two of them I want to visit: Big Ugly and Odd.
Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know, Orlin, that you're taller in the morning when you wake up?
I've heard that rumor. Doesn't seem to always pan out.
That's because the cartilage in your spine has had a chance to decompress over the night.
Amilcar, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, did you know that in my native country of Brazil, one of the most popular sodas is called Guaraná? I'm not sure if any of you here have had that experience. Amazing one. There's even one called Guaraná Jesus in the north. And Guaraná soda is actually made from an Amazonian berry that actually has more caffeine than coffee itself. So yes, Brazilians literally drink a soda that can dethrone your morning espresso.
Thanks, didn't know that. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, Orlin. So mine is about RFRAs. We talked about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Did you know that 29 states, West Virginia being one of them that we talked about today, have state RFRAs? Now, if you didn't know that, you definitely didn't know that 9 of the 9 additional states, their court system has guaranteed those same protections. So a total of 36 states in the United States have RFRA protections.
Wow. Thanks so much for being here with us. Really enjoyed our show. And thanks again for you being here. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.